Hi everyone, Alexandra Jarrett, Jupiter Returns here with your weekly astrology forecast, your day-by-day guide to the astrological influences that we will be all influenced by during the week of March the 2nd to the 8th of 2020. And last week was, I think the word we could use for last week was intense. If you watched me last week, you'll understand that was largely due to the square aspect between Venus and Pluto. This week's characteristic is more, let's say, changeable than intense, but still we have got some fun and games around. The Venus square Pluto aspect is now sort of coming to a close as Venus has moved on through the sign of Aries. But she's still going to be an important player in this week. So where are we today then? As I'm recording this, the moon, which we tend to check in with first, the moon today is now in the sign of Gemini. We enjoyed the moon's transit through certainly the second half of Taurus over the weekend, just helping to bring a little bit more stability and groundedness to this situation that we find ourselves in at this time. In Gemini, the moon is a little more busy. There's a lot more interaction, certainly a lot more going on mentally and verbally with the moon in Gemini. And today we find her applying to the first quarter square aspect. So as those of you who come to me for your monthly Moondala readings, you'll know this is the moment where the moon is 7 days on from when she was the new moon, when we had the moon and the sun meeting up in Pisces. Gemini is a sign that squares the sign of Pisces. So when the moon gets to the same degree in Gemini that the sun is at in Pisces, we have this first quarter square. And the first quarter square typically brings with it feelings of tension, feelings of irritation, and very much a provocation of our emotions, which in the sign of Gemini take on this very kind of wordy aspect to them. So difficulties perhaps in terms of, or an escalation even more of difficulties that we're having around conversations and communications in general. But as with all lunar transits, it will move on. So if that's been building up throughout the day, the peak comes around about tea time here in the UK, 5-6 p.m. And then the moon will start to separate from that aspect and move on deeper into Gemini. How your dream life may have been lately, Pisces is the sign that rules the sleep. It rules altered states of consciousness, and when we are in the sleep state, we're in the dreaming state. That is one of our altered states of consciousness, a very natural and typical altered state of consciousness that we all have to do in order to actually survive. When we have a Mercury retrograde in Pisces as well, you may have experienced, I've mentioned this a couple of times already in recent videos, you may have been having a particularly active dream life at the moment. By that, I mean more lucid dreaming, remembering your dreams being that more potent and powerful, or just disturbances in your sleep. As the moon moves through Gemini and moves into Cancer, we may get a little bit more of that as well. So paying a little bit more attention to the dream life, because this altered state of consciousness that we move into, in much the same way as, say, meditation, which is an altered state of consciousness, it allows us to access different parts of ourselves that contain useful information that we wouldn't otherwise ordinarily be able to access. And our dreams are very much that. There's a lot of work been done over the years into dream interpretation. And I think this is a really useful tool to learn a little bit about if you're having this experience at the moment, because, you know, we're accessing things that are hidden from ourselves. We're accessing the subconscious, we're we're being in contact with different realms of ourselves, even in the quantum field. So there's a lot of really important information that could come through at this time. And I'll talk a little bit more about the Mercury retrograde as the week progresses. But yeah, on Tuesday night in particular, that's when the moon is going to move into her home sign of Cancer. Moon rules the sign of Cancer, so she's particularly strong here, and she is waxing. She's gaining in strength now. She's in that half of the cycle where she's growing. So as she moves into Cancer on Tuesday night, in the dead of the night, that's when she's going to have a really easy flow of connection with Mercury retrograde. And this is really going to facilitate us accessing our dreams even more. You can even go to sleep that night with the intention, or with the request, or with the, the heartfelt desire to have an important dream, to communicate with a part of yourself that you'd like to access, and just have that as an intention, have that as a request of the universe, and see what comes through. It'd be interesting to note what people's dreams contain that night. Also on Tuesday, we have, now that Venus has finished her square aspect to Pluto over there in Capricorn, we now have her moving into a square aspect with Saturn. So I've talked in the past about how really with the whole of the zodiacal wheel, what we're looking at is cogs, layers, if you like, of influence. Some are deeper in the background, underlying, some are more on the surface. For example, the moon, that's very much on the surface, and it's a small cog. It's moving very fast and changing all the time. And there's layers and layers and layers and layers of these different cogs, like in clockwork, all right? And we can't sort of tell the time without all of those cogs working. And so what we have is we have the outer planets, the ones further out into space. They're having a bigger, slower, deeper, long-term effect on us. They're kind of working in the background, in the deepest background. Then as the planets become closer and closer to the Earth, they tend to become more easily accessible in terms of how we feel them within ourselves, how we notice their effect on us, and also how quickly these experiences arrive. So Venus is one of those close planets to us. She's one of what we call the personal planets. So we tend to be more tuned into her vibe, if you like. Saturn's a little bit further out. And when there's these combinations of planets that are closer and planets that are further out, they tend to be the ones, the bigger the distance, that tends to be the ones that tend to be more potent, the ones that have a bigger impact upon us. So we noticed last week, Venus rules money. She rules the financial markets. She rules food and the resources of life. And she rules our relationships. So I talked about with the aspect to Pluto, who over there in Capricorn is continuing this process of pulling apart the current system, Capricorn being our current structure. And very much so, the financial capitalist business kind of mentality is the structure of our current societal organization. So when Venus, particularly Venus in Aries, she's not comfortable there, moving into a challenging, provocative, tense aspect with Pluto over there, of course we saw what turned out to be the biggest falls in global stock markets since the financial crisis. Now, the financial crisis, of course, in 2008 was when Pluto first moved into the sign of Capricorn and sort of awakened us. Pluto's MO is death and rebirth. Let's change something in a deep and profound way. But it's usually in a crisis kind of provoking way. So we had this ingress of Pluto into Capricorn, and we had the ramifications on the global markets. And then things have kind of stagnated for a long time. And now we're seeing further provocation of that process as Pluto gets towards the end of Capricorn, ready to move into Aquarius and start a new part of our collective evolution. So as Pluto, really starts to get towards the end of Capricorn, we'll see an intensification of the process of, the destruction of that area in order to rebuild something better. That's the whole point. It's not destruction for destruction's sake. It's always so that the phoenix can rise from the ashes, always so that something better can come from this. So if you've had a challenging experience last week with the Pluto square Venus in your personal life, then take solace in the fact that this is always because, a crisis needed to happen, because unfortunately as human beings, we tend to not make the big changes in our lives that we need to make without a fair, hefty push. Venus is the ruler of our self-worth. She's the ruler of our esteem and how we show love and value. And that includes towards the self, arguably more so in Aries, the sign of the self. So if something cropped up, if there was some kind of crisis, then look for the deeper meaning in that process. Is this trying to show you that, this situation that you find yourself in isn't one that's conducive to self-love or to high values or kindness or all of the things that that Venus stands for? Okay, so yes, so we'll now move a little bit further round, and Venus will come into the similar square aspect with Saturn. Less intense, I suspect, but generally with a tense aspect like this between Venus and Saturn, what we typically see is restrictions. Saturn tends to create blockages. He is the authorities, and he's the fun police essentially. So he comes along to say no, generally. So it's a restriction of these Venusian qualities that we're likely to see. So I'm not sure that we're going to see anything of a recovery in the financial markets under this kind of sky. And it's trying to get us to take responsibility and ownership. That's what Saturn's MO is all about. He likes maturity. He likes being sensible. He likes doing things that last for the long term. And he likes you applying a bit of discipline to this, making some kind of personal sacrifice. Like, well, yeah, okay, if the relationship that I found myself in really wasn't good and healthy for me, if I look at myself through the eyes of someone who has good self-esteem, perhaps something has been taken away, so that I can now just apply some work, some effort to building my own sense of worth outside of that relationship. It could also be further blockages and restrictions to pleasure and fun. We may see, as a result of the coronavirus, we may see more difficulties with financial situation. We may see more difficulties with fun, such as travel, such as events, social events being cancelled or being restricted. These are all very typical kind of manifestations. So it may be a few days where we feel like, gosh, there's not much fun going on in the world. There's not much pleasure. There's not much to smile about. It might be that way that it shows up for you. But as always, these things are transient, okay? And we have to look at the bigger picture of how this is playing out. And we can channel this by knowing, this is the joy of astrology. This is how empowering astrology is that, when we know this is happening in advance, we can choose from the range of potential ways that this can show up in our lives. We can choose how to do that. So we could be at the mercy of this aspect, essentially, and go along the route of, gosh, life feels very difficult and challenged, and there's no fun, and I don't feel loved, and I don't feel, very good. There's not much pleasure around. Or we could say, let's channel this Saturn-Venus energy into doing some work around our Venus issues, whatever they might be in our life. Maybe I need to do some work on my relationship to money, or to worth, or to value, or to relationships, or just to other women. You know, Venus is women. And we might even see more of this manifestation of, for example, I've been listening this morning again on the radio to quite a severe backlash against Greta Thunberg again, who has had this meeting again at the weekend about climate change. And she seems to particularly come under target from, you know, Saturn's sort of less desirable manifestation, which can be the kind of the misogynist, it can be the sort of the traditional, you know, white male person who just wants to attack the female, who wants to attack particularly this youthful female. And it's very interesting to me, the comparison that was made this morning was that everything she says, everything this young girl, Venus in Aries, is saying is exactly the same as David Attenborough is saying. Now, he would be more your Capricorn, traditional, bit older, bit more mature, you know, traditional voice, traditional image. He would say exactly the same messages as Greta, and has been very vocal in his support for her and all the work that she does, and says that he wishes even that he could have had as much impact as she has had in the climate debate. And yet he comes under absolutely zero criticism, in fact, quite the opposite. And yet they both have the same message. So we might see a bit more of that kind of activity. And I think that's a really great opportunity for us to question. And that is essentially what a Mercury retrograde is all about. It's a time to just question everything. And it means questioning the self. Pisces is the sign, this is where the Mercury retrograde is taking place. Pisces has the sign which is furthest removed from ego. It's the egoless sign. So having Mercury retrograde here is asking us to question ourselves. Take your ego out of the way for the moment and just go, hold on a second. Do I have a bias? Do I have an unfounded opinion here? Do I have a belief system that actually I didn't intentionally create? It's something that's come through the ether and found me unintentionally. Certainly the case in Pisces, where our boundaries are down. So it's a fantastic time to just question those things and question other people, you know. Let's start having some accountability, which is a Saturn thing. Let's take some ownership of our stuff and absolutely call people out if they're not doing that equally. So that's my thoughts on the Saturn-Venus square and how it might play out. Wednesday, the Mercury retrograde is actually going to move back into the sign of Aquarius. So out of the kind of the more foggy, imaginative realms of Pisces and into an air sign. Okay, briefly. So this is going to give us another take on the Mercury retrograde process that we're going through. Aquarius is far more emotionally detached as an air sign. The water signs tend to be more sensitive and emotional, but the air signs, way more cognitive. So this is going to help us to see what we need to see through a more logical mindset. Very much so a mindset that is more biased towards equality and fairness and compassion towards others, but in less of an emotive way, just in a way that's kind of like, it just makes sense. You know, it makes sense that humanity come together and support each other. Just in terms of like logic, it's like we're more likely to survive if we pool our efforts than if we chop them all up and act separately and in competition with each other. So whereas Pisces kind of wants everyone to love each other and understand the higher energy that exists within people, Aquarius is more like, look, it just makes sense. We're safer, we're stronger together. So it's going to be an interesting part of the Mercury retrograde process, just to see how different a slant we can take on things when Mercury dips back into Aquarius. And of course, if you've got planets towards the end of Aquarius, or angles, they're gonna get pulled back into this story as well. So just question, think outside the box. You know, Mercury in Aquarius is fantastic for that. So if you're trying to come up with a different angle on something, bingo, this is the perfect energy to capture. So at this point, Venus actually reaches the very last degree of Aries, which could provoke some frustration, let's say. I think this might be a peak point in the week. It's kind of like when a planet gets to the end of the sign, they're like, oh, I've got to finish the work that I set out to do here. So there's almost like an increasing pressure on that sign, on that degree, of that sign, the final degree of the sign. It's like, I've got to get the job done before we move on. So there may be an increase in Venusian tensions at that time. So that means then on Thursday, the Venus will move into the sign of Taurus. Much, much happier in Taurus. I love Venus in Taurus energy. People that I know that have Venus in Taurus tend to be very gentle people who have a particular fondness for the pleasures of life, certainly food, quite often music, and I know a number of people who are very musically inclined. Taurus is the sign of our senses. It's the sign of our body, our earthly body embodiment. And so Venus here rules the pleasures of the senses: touch, taste, sound, smell, everything. Venus in Taurus likes luxury. She likes the silk and caviar and champagne and, you know, having a really beautiful, pleasurable time and really enjoying what it means to be a human being in terms of the physicality of a human being. So it's lovely, pleasurable energy. She's back on her home ground. So Venus rules two signs. She rules Venus and she also rules Libra. Now later on in her cycle today, this year, when she moves into Libra, it's not going to be quite as pleasurable because Libra is one of the signs that squares, you know, the difficult, challenging energies that we have going on in Capricorn. So if you're planning anything Venus related, best to catch her now. I think she's at the strongest that we're going to see her all year in her time, in her journey through Taurus. Also, she's coming closer and closer and closer to the Earth at this point because, as early as 9th of April, I think she starts the retrograde process that she's going to be moving into in the sign of Gemini. So the closer and closer she's getting to retrograde, that means the closer she is coming to the Earth and the more we're able to feel her. So this is a really great time to call in Venus, to talk with her, to just communicate with her. Venus loves connection. That's what she's all about. She wants to bring two people together in pleasure, in harmony, in joy. So this is a fantastic time to connect with Venus and start to sort of lay the foundations essentially for the Venus retrograde period. Excuse me. And of course, I'll be here to walk you through the whole of the Venus retrograde period as I was last time 2 years ago when this last happened. So enjoy, make the most of the Venus in Taurus vibe. She's going to be immediately applying, that means coming together, to the conjunction with the planet Uranus. So the first part of her transit in Taurus might not be quite quite as wonderful, potentially, could be even more so. Uranus brings an erratic energy. So until she's clear of Uranus, I don't think we can sort of do anything too stable. But I'll continue to talk about that later in the week when she becomes exact with that degree. So yeah, she's going to be applying to Uranus. By this point, as we move into the weekend, the moon will have continued through Cancer. And as we reach the weekend, the moon's actually going to be in Leo. Very powerful by this point because she's growing and growing and growing. We're moving towards the full moon in Virgo. So she's only one sign behind over the weekend, which means, you know, she's really getting quite potent now. Moon in Leo loves drama. You know, Leo is very expressive energy. It's very boisterous, playful energy, and it does like an audience. It really does. So, you know, it likes to play things out. It likes to play a role. Essentially, Leo sees the world as a stage for it to perform on. We all have Leo in our chart somewhere, so this applies to all of us in some aspect of our life. But certainly, if you know any Leos, or people with a moon or rising sign in Leo, you'll know there's a little bit more flamboyance to them. There's a greater love of playfulness and drama and having fun and having excitement and certainly like dressing up, playing different characters, that kind of thing. So watch out for that, because obviously, you know, there's desirable aspects of that and there can be less desirable aspects of that depending upon, you know, whether that person is particularly self-aware or not. Some dramas great, some dramas not so welcome. At this point, we also have the Sun will have got to the place in his transit through Pisces where he's going to be joining up with Neptune. So we've got this combination of both of the lights, the luminaries, moon and sun, in very imaginative places. Sun connecting with Neptune is really going to heighten our imagination and our creativity. That's very much what Neptune's all about. So when we combine this with the kind of the drama and the performance and the fun-loving nature of the moon in Leo, it could be fantastic if you're doing any kind of performance, if you're putting on any kind of performance, or if you're doing any work that's involved in a creative project, then that's going to be wonderful energy to capture. But on the potential downside, the Sun meeting Neptune like this does make us that little bit more empathetic. It brings our boundaries down a little bit. So it leaves us that little bit more vulnerable to the energies of other people that may be a little bit more boisterous with the moon in Leo. The moon in Leo is kind of like a big dog who just isn't aware of his own size, and he just bounds along the beach wanting to play with all the little dogs, forgetting its own size. You know, it can have that kind of that's a metaphor that I would use for this kind of energy. So when our boundaries are a little bit down, a little bit less guarded, with this Neptune combination here, you know, that may be something really just to look out for, and potentially it could feed into any possible drama that shows up in our life. So it's through on Sunday evening that we get the exact conjunction of Venus and Uranus, quite late on in the evening. So we'll be feeling that energy kind of building up throughout the weekend and certainly through Sunday. So what does a Venus-Uranus conjunction look like? Well, we know we're familiar by now with the issues that Venus relates to. Uranus brings things that happen suddenly. Uranus is like lightning. So it's very unexpected, unforeseen events. It's a very erratic and unstable energy. So it tends to be related to shocks and surprises. Now, depending obviously on the context of the situation, a shock or a surprise might be something that's not very welcome, or it could be something that's very welcome. So, for example, this could bring about more instability in the financial markets. Certainly, Taurus rules the financial markets and Venus rules money. So there could be a little bit more instability, particularly as here in the UK and London, the FTSE will open on Monday morning. So we will see the effects on Monday morning, but Sunday evening, there may be a little bit more of an influence bringing volatility to the markets. But equally, that you might get a surprise, shocking, unexpected windfall. You could, this is the kind of energy under which you could gamble, and that could really go either way. You could get carried away with it, but there could be an unforeseen win of some kind, a windfall. It could be even falling in love at first sight, just that, whoa, wow, who is that person? It's not something, however, that has a lasting effect. Uranus is kind of here one minute and gone the next. So if you're looking for a longer term connection, then I wouldn't get too carried away if that kind of thing shows up in your life, because it's unlikely to be something that kind of has a longer duration. If you're just looking for, to have some fun, to have something short term, absolutely perfect energy that may well find you. If that's kind of your intention, that's what you're putting out there, then absolutely perfect. So yeah, it can also bring kind of impulsive behavior, that speed, if you like. I mean, it's essentially that can show up that way as well. So you could just decide to go, to hell with it, around issues with money, with food, with pleasure, with shopping, Venus and Taurus. But it could also be that if you went shopping, you suddenly find this most amazing thing that you hadn't set out to find, or you find a really great bargain. So it's that combination of the unexpected along with Venus things. You could, if you're already in a relationship, you could be surprised. Your partner may do something very spontaneous, a loving gesture that perhaps you hadn't anticipated, you didn't see coming, something like that. And certainly, that's something that you could do to capture this energy. Perhaps, decide to surprise your lover in some lovely way with this Sun and Neptune combination going on in Venus. It might be a nice time to just do something romantic and creative that's going to really bring a pleasant surprise into somebody's life. That would be a beautiful way to capture this energy. So that's what I have for you. It's going to be a very, very interesting week, a changeable week. And there is more to come. We have where the Saturn-Pluto conjunction took place in Capricorn on January the 12th, which I think it's fair to say is most likely behind the difficult and challenging experiences that we're seeing showing up in the world right now, particularly with the coronavirus or COVID-19. That's not a done deal at all. The Saturn-Pluto conjunction is going on in the background. We then have Jupiter. Jupiter is coming along, and Jupiter is going to meet up with Pluto in the very near future, also at that same degree that Saturn and Pluto conjuncted. And then we have Mars as well. So I will check in with you as those things crop up, but just bear in mind, there is bigger things going on in the background. It's not all about, something precisely happening on an exact date. That's more something that we might associate with the moon or with these more closer planets. So I really hope that my astrology helps to teach you a little bit of astrology as well. That's certainly something that I aim to do, rather than just giving you my interpretation as an astrologer. What I'm hoping to do is really bring the knowledge of astrology to life. So if you value the work that I'm doing, please give me a like, a love, a share, a comment. Please make sure that you subscribe to my YouTube video. These are all ways that you can play your part, which is a Piscean thing, in facilitating this knowledge and empowerment getting out to other people. Because I really feel that astrology is a force for good. And this is a time when, my goodness, the world really does need that. So if you can just help in that process just a little bit, that's really, really welcome. Thank you so much for watching. As always, if you have any questions, put them in the comments below and I will do my absolute best to answer those. Thank you as always. Have a beautiful week. I'll see you next time. Lots of love.